An American pilot dropped bombs on Berlin. Thousands of people looked up. They cheered. That's not a typo. You've probably heard this story filed under World War II operations. It wasn't. You've probably heard Berlin described as an enemy city when this happened. It wasn't. Not anymore. And here's the part that will genuinely stop you cold. The pilot acted completely alone, with zero authorization, zero budget, and zero orders, and fully expected to be court-martialed the moment his commanding officer found out. But stay with me until the end, because I'll tell you something even stranger. The Soviet Union filed an official government protest. Over candy. Welcome to World War II Objects. Every object tells a story. To understand what Gail Halvorsen did, you first need to understand what Berlin looked like in the summer of 1948. World War II had ended 3 years earlier. Germany was divided. Berlin, sitting deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, was carved into 4 sectors managed by the Allied powers. And on June 24, 1948, Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin made a calculated move. He cut every single land route into West Berlin. Every road, every rail line, every canal. 2 million people, sealed off overnight. Picture the math. West Berlin needed an estimated 4,500 tons of food, coal and supplies every single day just to survive at minimum levels. Stalin's bet was simple: starve them out. Force the Western Allies to abandon the city, or force West Berliners to beg the Soviets for food on Soviet terms. What happened instead became one of the most extraordinary logistical operations in military history. The United States and Britain launched the Berlin Airlift, officially called Operation Vittles by the Americans. Around the clock, Douglas C-47 Sky trains and Douglas C-54 Skymasters began hammering supply runs into Tempelhof Airport. The C-54s alone could haul up to 10 tons of cargo per flight. Pilots flew in staggered altitude bands, separated by 500-foot buffer zones, arriving every few minutes in a continuous chain that never stopped. Day, night, rain, fog, or Soviet harassment from fighter aircraft below. It was relentless, it was exhausting, and it was barely enough. But here's the question nobody was asking in the summer of 1948. What about the children? You can fly in flour, you can fly in coal, you can keep bodies alive. But something else was being starved out of Berlin that summer. Something you can't weigh on a cargo manifest. That's where one pilot changed everything. And he did it with 2 sticks of gum. Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen was 27 years old, flying C-54s for the 17th Military Air Transport Squadron out of Rhein-Main Air Base. He'd grown up on small farms in Idaho and Utah, joined the Army Air Corps after Pearl Harbor, trained with the Royal Air Force, and spent the war ferrying transport planes across England, Italy, and North Africa. He was not a general. He was not a diplomat. He was a pilot doing supply runs. On a July afternoon in 1948, Halvorsen decided to walk the perimeter of Tempelhof Airport, and at the barbed wire fence he found approximately 30 children standing quietly, not begging, not shouting, just watching the aircraft. And they asked him about the planes, about how much weight they could carry, about whether the Americans would keep flying when winter made the approaches dangerous. And one of them said something that stopped him completely. "When the weather gets so bad you can't land, don't worry about us. We can get by on little food, but if we lose our freedom, we may never get it back." Halvorsen reached into his flight suit pocket. 2 sticks of Wrigley's gum, everything he had. He broke them in half and passed all 4 pieces through the barbed wire to 30 children. Here's what he described watching happen next, in his own words. "Those with the gum tore off strips of the wrapper and gave them to the others. Those with the strips put them to their noses and smelled the tiny fragrance. The expression of pleasure was unmeasurable." Think about that for a moment. Children so hungry for something sweet that they passed around the wrapper to smell it. A piece of paper, a ghost of sugar. Halvorsen made them a promise on the spot. Next flight into Tempelhof, he would drop candy from his aircraft, more than he could hand through a fence. They asked the obvious question: how would they recognize his C-54 among the dozens circling overhead? "I'll wiggle my wings," he told them. He went back to base, gathered candy from unused rations, pulled out his own personal handkerchiefs, tied bundles at the corners with string, and fashioned the most primitive parachutes you can imagine. The next day, on approach to Tempelhof, he tilted his wings and released 3 small bundles through the aircraft's emergency flare tubes. The children were waiting exactly where he'd left them. He had no authorization, no budget, no plan beyond the next flight, and no idea what he had just started. Here's what most people don't realize about how Operation Little Vittles actually grew, because it didn't grow the way a military program grows. It went viral. In 1948, more children showed up at the fence each week. Word spread across the city. Letters started arriving at Tempelhof addressed to Uncle Wiggly Wings and the Chocolate Uncle. Children writing in careful handwriting, asking for drops at specific locations. One letter asked Halvorsen to find the house with the white chickens and drop the candy there. He circled. He looked. He never found those chickens, so he mailed the chocolate through the Berlin Postal Service instead. Meanwhile, back at base, here's Halvorsen's crew chief and co-pilot donated their own candy rations. Then the rest of his squadron. His bunk started filling up with chocolate bars and handkerchiefs left by fellow airmen who'd heard the story. And then a Berlin newspaper ran it. A reporter had spotted Halvorsen's C-54 by its tail number during a candy run and published the story. It spread across Europe within days. The next morning, an officer was waiting at Halvorsen's aircraft when he landed. "The colonel wants to see you right now." Halvorsen walked into that office in the full expectation that his military career was finished. His commanding officer looked at him and then pulled out the newspaper. A full article, his tail number clearly visible in the photograph. "What you doing, Halvorsen?" He told him everything. What happened next is the part that matters. Instead of a court-martial, the story reached Airlift Commander General William Tunner, and Tunner immediately saw something no propaganda office had manufactured. He delivered 4 words: "Keep doing it." Operation Little Vittles officially launched on September 22, 1948. And now it had the full weight of the United States Air Force behind it. The National Confectioners Association contacted Halvorsen and asked how much candy he could use. He gave them a number he described as ridiculous. Their answer: "We'll send all you can drop." Back in the United States, school children in Chicopee, Massachusetts, transformed a local fire station on Grape Street into the stateside headquarters of the operation, affiliated with Westover Air Force Base. Every afternoon after school, students assembled candy parachutes by hand. By November 1948, the Bud Manufacturing Company had donated 11,000 yards of linen for handkerchiefs alone. Lifesaver Corporation in Port Chester, New York, sent 1,200 rolls of Lifesavers. Hershey's chocolate bars arrived by the case. 25 air crews were now flying candy runs over Berlin alongside their regular supply missions. They loaded big cardboard boxes, cut the tops open, held them up against the escape hatch, and the slipstream scattered the bundles like seeds across the city below. By January 1949, Halvorsen and his fellow pilots had dropped over 250,000 miniature parachutes carrying candy to nearly 100,000 children across West Berlin. Total candy delivered by the end of the operation on May 13, 1949, approximately 23 tons. 23 tons of chocolate and gum falling from military aircraft tied to handkerchiefs. No weapons. No strategic objective on any map. Just the promise a 27-year-old pilot made to 30 kids at a barbed wire fence. And now we get to what I told you about at the very start, because here is the detail that most people, and honestly, a lot of history coverage, still gets wrong. This was not a World War II operation. Operation Little Vittles ran from September 22, 1948 to May 13, 1949. 3 full years after VE Day on May 8, 1945. The war was over. Berlin was not an enemy city. It was an Allied-occupied former enemy city whose civilians had chosen to endure a blockade rather than submit to Soviet control. The bomb in this story was a handkerchief knotted at 4 corners. The enemy was hunger, and the pilot wasn't attacking anyone. He was keeping a personal promise. Why does the myth persist? Partly because the story gets packaged alongside World War II content, partly because the language of candy bombing deliberately echoes wartime, and partly because what happened next looked so strategic that it's hard to believe it started with 2 sticks of gum and 0 orders. Here's the confirmation that it worked beyond anything a military planner could have designed. The Soviet Union filed an official protest with the United States State Department. Their formal complaint was that Operation Little Vittles violated their propaganda agreement. Read that again. The Soviets complained, officially, diplomatically, on paper, about candy parachutes. That protest is the clearest possible evidence of what those handkerchiefs actually did. Historian Coyote M. O'Connell, writing in the Smithsonian, described it precisely. Halvorsen had provided a face for the airlift and the US's humanitarian mission at large, while successfully enlisting the American public in an early Cold War contest for hearts and minds. The US military sent Halvorsen on a stateside publicity tour. The documentary film covering Operation Vittles, released by the US Air Force in 1948, was nominated for Best Documentary Short Subject at the 21st Academy Awards. A spontaneous act by one pilot had become America's most effective Cold War tool of that moment. Not a weapon, a wrapper. A smell of sugar through a fence. The debate historians still have is whether to call it pure humanitarianism or calculated propaganda. Historian Andrei Cherny, in The Candy Bombers, argues the drops were central to winning the entire ideological battle of the Berlin Blockade. And Tunnel and the Candy Bomber Foundation argued just as strongly that the origin was nothing but genuine compassion, and no serious scholar disputes Halvorsen's personal sincerity. The honest answer is both things are true. The origin was spontaneous and human. The exploitation was swift and deliberate. That's what made it unstoppable. Gail Halvorsen lived to age 101, dying in February 2022. He made approximately 35 goodwill trips back to Berlin over his lifetime. He kept in contact with the children he'd never actually met, including a woman named Mercedes, who had written him in 1948 asking him to find her white chickens. 22 years later, in 1970, when Halvorsen was posted as commander of Tempelhof Airport, she invited him to dinner and showed him the exact spot where the chickens had been. He had mailed her the chocolate. She had kept the letter. So the next time you see a handkerchief-sized parachute in a museum case, stitched with rough string and a faded candy wrapper, you'll know it's not just a piece of cloth. It's an act of engineering born from nothing but a pocket and a promise. It's a human impulse that made a superpower file a formal complaint. It's proof that the smallest decent thing, done without orders, can fly further than any bomb ever built. Thank you for watching WW2 Objects. If you have suggestions, from field ration tins to navigation compasses to parachute equipment, drop them in the comments and we'll give you a shout out. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story from the battlefield.